It says, beginning in verse 1, Now about that time Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church. And he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread. When he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Peter therefore was kept in prison, but prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. And when Herod would have brought him forth the same night, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and the keepers before the door kept the prison. And behold, the angel of the Lord came upon him, and a light shined in the prison. He smote Peter on the side, and raised him up, saying, Arise up quickly. And his chains fell off his hands. And the angel said unto him, Gird thyself, and bind on thy sandals. And so he did. And saith unto him, Cast thy garment about thee, and follow me. And he went out and followed him, and wist not that it was true which was done by the angel, but thought he saw a vision. When they were past the first and the second ward, they came into the iron gate that leadeth unto the city, which opened to them of his own accord. And they went out and passed on through one street, and forthwith the angel departed from him. And when Peter was come to himself, he said, Now I know of a surety that the Lord hath sent his angel, and hath delivered me out of the hand of Herod, and from all the expectation of the people of the Jews. When he had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. And as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a damsel came to hearken, named Rhoda. When she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness, but ran in and told how Peter stood before the gate. And they said unto her, Thou art mad. But she constantly affirmed that it was even so. Then said they, It is his angel. But Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. But he, beckoning unto them with his hand to hold their peace, declared unto them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, Go show these things unto James and to the brethren. And he departed and went into another place. Now as soon as it was day, there was no small stir among the soldiers what was become of Peter. And when Herod had sought for him and found him not, he examined the keepers and commanded that they should be put to death. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea, and there abode. I want to try to cover this section, at least much of this section today in our study. Notice that Herod is the king. The Herods are an interesting study. We don't have time to go into all the Herods this morning, but you can read through the Scriptures and know that they were involved in a lot of things. You can know that they were a family that was dysfunctional in every way. They were a family that had marriages that were not as they should have been. They were families that had children who were sometimes put to death for fear that they might rise up and take the throne. It was a very, very superstitious, very scandalous, very strange family in many ways. And here we have Herod the king. He stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church. Now we've seen the church grow in the book of Acts, and we've seen the church face persecution. And the persecution that the church has faced in large measure has been because of the Jews and because of their persecution. Herod is one who seeks the favor of the Jews, and therefore he will do certain things in order to court their favor, in order to get their support, in order to make them happy. Because they had the power to make life easy on you, or they had the power to make life hard on you. And Herod is looking for them to help him, to make life easy on him. You remember that was a part of why Jesus was delivered up to Pilate. That's part of why Pilate did what he did in the trial of Jesus. It was not that Pilate thought that Jesus was guilty. Pilate examined Jesus. Pilate found no fault in him. Pilate's wife told him to have nothing to do with that just man. Pilate was able to see through the crowd. He was able to see that because of envy, they had delivered him. And so Pilate knew that Jesus was not guilty. But why did Pilate agree, go along with, even though he washed his hands, he was the one ultimately in charge, why did Herod go along with the death of Jesus? You remember what the Jews said to him? If he did not do what they were asking him to do, they said, Thou art not the friend of whom? You're not the friend of Caesar. The Jews had the power to call into question Pilate's loyalty to Caesar. That was something you did not want to do. You did not want Caesar for any moment to think that you were not completely loyal to him. Caesars had ultimate authority. They could command the death of anyone at any moment. And it was easier to just command the death of someone than it was to really take a lot of time and look into whether or not they were guilty of the charge that was made against them. Sometimes Caesars, if there's even so much as a question as to whether or not someone was loyal, then they were done. It was over with. Just put somebody else into his position. There's always someone waiting to take a position like the one Pilate had. Pilate knew that. Pilate was struggling to keep favor with Caesar, and so Pilate thought it easier to go along with the people, to give them what they wanted, so that they would not rebel, so that they would not cause a disturbance. See, all the Jews had to do was to create a disturbance, which is easy enough to do, and Rome would, naturally, that would be drawn to Rome's attention. And Caesar would look at that, and Caesar would say, Pilate's not doing a very good job. Pilate doesn't seem to be keeping those people under control. Pilate seems to be letting things get stirred up there. And you know what could happen if it isn't stopped, and if it isn't stopped quickly. They could create a stir that would call Caesar's attention. Caesar either would replace Pilate because he did not think Pilate was doing a good job in controlling it, or the Jews might even be able to put the spin on it that Pilate was behind it. That Pilate was actually provoking them. Pilate was actually stirring them up. Pilate was in with Jesus. He was in with this insurrectionist. He was behind the rebellion of Jesus. That wasn't true, of course. It wasn't true about Jesus. It would not have been true about Pilate, but that would not have mattered. Caesar would have handled it from Rome. He would have sent an order and it would have been dealt with that quickly. Things would have gone back and been peaceful again, simply because the Jews would have had what they wanted. And so they exert a great deal of pressure over the religious leaders of their day. We have situations somewhat like that today, don't we? We have some special interest groups in our country who say, you will do what we want you to do, or if you don't, we'll make trouble for you. You will sponsor this parade that we're having, and if you don't, then we're going to tell everyone this or that about you. You're going to lose a lot of business. You're going to face a lot of government intervention. You're going to face a lot of problems unless you promote what we want you to promote. Unless you go along with our agenda, we're going to make life hard on you. And you look at the corporations from Home Depot to Walmart to McDonald's to on we could go, who have caved into that kind of pressure, who've given into it because they want to avoid problems. They don't want to deal with that. It's just easier to give a little bit of money to make it hush up so they can go on making more money than that. And these groups know that, and so they exert that kind of pressure. Whether it be a racial group, whether it be a group that has immoral practices or intentions, they exert pressure, exert a great deal of pressure over businesses and over our government. And so we have some of that today. And here we see it in the days of the church, as Herod stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church. Now, as we get up to this point, there has been persecution, but the persecution in large measure, at least the greatest persecution, and certainly the putting of death of people, has been against Christians. We have Stephen, who was an evangelist, Stephen, who was a special servant in some way that had been selected to serve the church. Of course, Stephen was put to death. The apostles have been persecuted along with the church, but in large measure, the apostles have had enough people behind them. They've had enough support to where some individuals at least have been fearful to lay hands on them. They've laid hands on people on the fringe. They've laid hands on members, but by and large, the apostles have escaped some of that. They've been able to carry on their work. But when we get to this chapter, the persecution turns toward the apostles. Now you knew Satan would do that, right? You knew Satan would persecute the church. You knew Satan would persecute whoever he could. He would try to deter people from being Christians by persecuting Christians, by making life hard on Christians. He would discourage some individuals. He would convince some individuals that he wasn't worth the price they would have to pay. When that has not stopped the growth of the church, he begins to come closer and closer to the center of that group. Now he begins to attack the leaders of that group. He begins to persecute them in hopes that it too will have its effect on stopping the growth of the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. That's a bold move, isn't it? It's a bold move to strike this inner circle and to kill one of those who had been the closest in that group. It's a bold move on Herod's part. Now, how is that action met by the Jews? What's their reaction to it? They're very pleased with it. They've wanted this for a long time. They moved the people, they moved Pilate to kill Jesus. They thought they were done when they killed Jesus. They had silenced him. No doubt they must have thought within their minds, as soon as we kill Jesus, the sheep will be scattered. These apostles won't long continue that work. They may for a time try to keep on the work of Jesus, but once their leader is gone, once the one who has the power is gone, they'll quickly give in to persecution and pressure, and it'll go away. That's what they thought. But it didn't go away. It continued to grow. The apostles continued to preach and teach that the tomb was empty. They couldn't silence that message any more than they had been able to silence Jesus. Now, if you've tried something before and been successful in doing it, the likelihood is that you will go and do it again. They felt successful in ridding the world of Jesus. Now they'll go after someone else, and then someone else, and then someone else. Do you remember regarding in John chapter 11, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Do you remember what the Jews wanted to do when Lazarus had been raised from the dead? They wanted to kill him. He died, Jesus raised him from the dead, and the Jews want to kill him. Now why do they want to kill him? They can't deny what's happened, right? Everyone knows Lazarus was dead. Everyone knows that Lazarus came back from the dead. And so, what's the easiest way to get all of this to go away? Put Lazarus back in the grave again, right? That's what they intend to do. That's what they're trying to do with the apostles here. He killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. Can you imagine what it would be like if you were preaching and teaching the gospel, your brother was preaching and teaching the gospel, and your brother was killed in persecution? Can you imagine what that would have been like? Imagine how hard it would have been to continue to press on in preaching the gospel once that had happened. It does make you more determined if you're fully convinced of the truth of what you're preaching, and you're fully convinced that He died in preaching that and He has gone to heaven. It makes you want to join Him there. It makes you also want to pay the ultimate price if it's necessary to do that. But how hard that must have been to have someone in your immediate family who had been taken away. But you know, there were many Christians who had already experienced this. Right? Acts chapter 8 and verse 4. They that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word. Why were they scattered abroad? Well, they were scattered abroad because of persecution. Saul had made havoc of the church, hailing men and women, literally dragging men and women. And so there had been families that had already been torn apart by this persecution. Why should James and John think it would be any different for their family? Why should they think that they would be immune from it? You know, we have to understand that preaching families, elder families, deacon families, and on we could go, missionary families, are not immune to the problems that come to other families. They're just not. The persecution that comes to other families also will come to them. The heartache and the suffering that comes to other families, it sometimes makes its way to their families as well. We have to understand that, be aware of that. There's no one immune from this. All that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. 2 Timothy 3 at verse 12, it comes to every family, including the family of James and John, including this family that had been as close to the Lord as any family had been. It comes to them. He killed John with a sword. We see some parallels here. We see what had happened earlier with John the Baptist. John the Baptist being beheaded for his stand for truth. Here's someone else who has lost his head. Evidently, could have stabbed him with a sword, could have killed him that way, but more than likely beheaded him in much the way that John the Baptist had been beheaded. He killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. He gets bolder in his actions, doesn't he? Peter's a bigger prize even than what James was. Now, Peter was not the first pope, not in any sense of the imagination was that true. But Peter was well known. He had been the leading character in the first chapters of the book of Acts, right? We know Peter had been a primary spokesman. We know that Peter had always been the one that tended to be out in front. That was his nature. Peter was bold. Peter was the one who stood against the Jews so boldly, along with John in Acts chapter 3 and Acts chapter 4. Whether we ought to obey you or God, judge you. We cannot but speak and teach the things that we've seen and heard. It's Peter that said we ought to obey God rather than men. Peter was the one that had been so bold. He was the one that declared, "You with wicked hands have taken and crucified and slain." Peter was bold. You can see how great of a prize Peter would have been. And he gains boldness from killing James, and so now he lays hands on Peter. It's interesting, isn't it, that God allowed Herod to lay hands on Peter. He allowed Herod to capture Peter, take Peter into custody. Could God have prevented that? Absolutely. There were times where Jesus walked through the midst of those that were seeking to arrest him. They were unable to stop him. God helping him, just simply walk through their midst. It's possible, right? Possible this time that Peter could have avoided being arrested altogether. Could God have prevented the death of James? Certainly he could have, but James dies. He's killed by Herod. Why did God allow that? Why did God allow this to take place? It's a test, isn't it? It's a test of those early Christians. It's a test of John. It's a test of Peter. It's a test of others. Whether or not they will survive this type of persecution in their midst. He saw that it pleased the Jews. He proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of the unleavened bread. Now you notice, and we've seen this before in the book of Acts, that so many of the things that happen as far as persecution are concerned, are centered around these feast days of the Jews. You think about Jesus and his death. You think about some of the other things that took place around these key times where the number of Jews in the city of Jerusalem would have been up. The number would have swollen during these critical times as people poured into the city for the observance of these feasts. If Herod wanted to gain the favor of the Jews, what better time did he have to do it than right now? They're pouring into this city. Herod can ride this wave of public opinion, and he can sway the public opinion by doing this at this time in their presence. You can imagine the kind of reaction he would get because of the number of people that would be there and that would see them. We've talked about the fact that the population of this city could swell from 200,000 all the way up to 2 million. Or those type of heavy swings during some of these key times during these feasts. This was one of those. And think about this, and this is just something to consider. These were the days of unleavened bread. Do you remember this feast, and do you remember the removal of leaven from their houses? You remember all that was involved in that. You remember how that they would take a candle and search their houses for the smallest little piece of bread and they would find it and they would say, "Aha! I found you!" And they would take it and they would cast it out in the street, ridding their houses of all leaven, getting rid of anything that was impure. Well, let's think about what persecution does to the church. Does persecution not remove leaven from the church? What happens when heavy persecution comes upon the church? What happens to those who aren't fully committed? They either get committed or they go away. And many of them will go away. They'll go away to avoid that persecution. But what happens to those who stay? They become that much more convinced, that much more determined. This may cost me my life. I've got to be serious about this. I've got to be committed to this. And so these are the days of unleavened bread, and the leaven is being removed from the early Christians too. The ones who are going to stay are the ones who are committed, the ones who are determined to give their lives if necessary for the cause of Christ. It says in verse 4, "And when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison, delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter," or a better translation would be Passover, "to bring him forth to the people." Now when we look at this, I want you to consider how well guarded Peter was. I want you to think about all these soldiers that were there. We're going to see that he's kept in prison. And notice in verse 6, he was sleeping between 2 soldiers. He was bound with 2 chains, not 1 chain, but 2 chains. The keepers before the door kept the prison. Now think about how guarded he was. All of these soldiers, all are required to guard Peter. He's sleeping between 2 soldiers. Now they're not sleeping, he's sleeping. But he's between 2 soldiers. There's 2 chains. Many times you'd be chained to 1 soldier. We've talked about before in the case of Paul that there was 18 inches of chain that separated him and the soldier that was guarding him. And every 4 hours there was a change. Another soldier would come in, and so Paul had the opportunity to literally teach the gospel to a number of individuals. They were separated by 18 inches of chain. They couldn't go anywhere. Paul had a captive audience. And so we can understand why Paul would say in the book of Romans that he's had some success in Caesar's household. Some of Caesar's own guards, some of Caesar's own special forces have been converted through Paul in this time that he spent with him. Here's Peter, 18 inches of chain, a soldier on either side. Peter's not going anywhere. He is inside of a locked jail, and there are soldiers outside of that door as well. Peter is well guarded. But can you guard Peter well enough? Could you possibly? You could have stationed every soldier in the Roman army outside of this jail. And if God wanted to deliver Peter, guess what would have happened? Peter would have walked right on out. There was no preventing that. There was no stopping that. That's the amazing thing about men, isn't it? You think about Jesus, you think about the Jews. Jesus is dead. They placed him in the tomb. They wrote a huge stone to cover the entrance to that tomb. They have marked it as not to be opened under the decree of Caesar. They have placed 2 soldiers there to guarantee no one gets into that tomb. But what happened? Stones rolled away. Soldiers are there. They can't prevent a single thing from happening. Jesus is raised from the dead. No stopping it, right? It's amazing to me when you look at some of these things that here's a man who says, we're going to make sure this doesn't happen. But there's no stopping or preventing God. There's no overpowering, overruling Him. This is going to be another situation of that. Intending after Easter to bring Him forth to the people, literally after Passover, to bring Him forth from the people. You remember the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the days of Unleavened Bread leading up to the Passover lamb, the offering of that Passover lamb. In Acts chapter 12, they're still offering the Passover lamb. What's wrong with that picture? Okay, Jesus was a Passover lamb, right? Jesus already died. He's already been offered. Jude says and Hebrews as well says once for all delivered, right? Once Jesus, the Passover lamb, died, was there any need for any future Passover lambs? Passover lambs after the death of Jesus had no power whatsoever to save. In fact, after the death of Jesus, what do they have the power to do? Only to condemn. They don't have the power to save. They only have the power to condemn. If you offer a Passover lamb after Calvary, you have put yourself in the position of someone who's done despite under the Spirit of grace. You're someone who's trodden underfoot the blood of the Son of God. That's what Hebrews chapter 10 is all about, right? You go back under that old law, you go back and observe that old law, you go back and offer the sacrifices of that old law, you're rejecting Jesus. These Jews had rejected Jesus. They're still offering the Passover lamb. They do not believe that Jesus died for their sins. They believe that Jesus died as a sinner and not for sins. They continue to offer these Passover lambs. Herod is going to try to give them the ultimate prize. Think about Jesus. Think about his own death. Think about the time when it took place, and then think about Peter and Peter's potential death here. It says, Peter therefore was kept in prison, but prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. We've talked about before that there's one thing in this world that no one can stop, and that's prayer. You can stop a lot of things. To some degree, you can stop the preaching of the gospel. To some degree, you can persecute. You can keep that from taking place. Obviously, the Jews tried to do that. The apostles continue to preach and teach. But you certainly can slow that down, if not prevent that. But there's one thing that you cannot do. And that is you cannot stop prayer. Can you really stop prayer in school? Yeah, exactly. Right? You can't stop prayer in school. You can stop it from being done over the intercom. You can stop it from being done before ball games. You can stop it from being done around the flagpole, perhaps. But you can't stop prayer in school. If we teach our young people to pray, our young people can pray in school all day, every day, if they want to. No one can prevent that. You know, no one can stop you from praying for them. Nobody can stop you from doing that. You can go by and say, I'd like to sit down with you and have a Bible study with you. No, I'm not interested. I don't want to have a Bible study with you. I'd like to come in and talk to you about coming back and being faithful to the Lord. No, I don't have any intentions of doing that. I'm not going to talk with you. People can tell you that, right? At the door. Can they stop you from praying for them? They can't stop you from praying for them. They can't stop you from going home and getting down on your knees and asking God for a change of their heart. They can't stop you from praying that something might happen that would soften them. They can't stop you from praying those kinds of things. They can't prevent that. We need to understand the power that we have in prayer. It's a power that the world simply cannot stop. President Obama, he can't stop us from praying for him. He can't stop it. He can't stop us from praying that he would be moral and that he would make decisions in favor of life. He can't stop us from praying that. That's a power that we have that cannot be prevented. But how often do we allow that power to go untapped, unused, because we don't pray? But the church was praying for Peter. And it was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. It was made without ceasing. You remember the Bible says pray without ceasing. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. What does it mean to pray without ceasing? Okay? Being always in a prayerful attitude, being always in a position to where you can pray and are praying. Think about prayer. Think about where you can pray and when you can pray. Can you pray going down the road? Absolutely you can. How many of us started a journey and realized, I didn't say a prayer, I need to pray. I'm fixing to take this journey, I need to pray. You don't have to close your eyes. In fact, I recommend that you don't. But you can pray, right, as you go down the road. Can you pray at work? Absolutely you can. We can pray wherever we are, as long as it's a place where prayer can be made. There are certain places where if we are there, we're not in a praying position, because we ought not to be there. Unless there's a change of heart on our part and we're trying to get out of there, that would be the only situation where that would be effective. But prayer was made without ceasing of the church. Now the church is made up of men and women, right? Men and women are praying for him. Women cannot pray publicly in a service such as this today in the presence of men, but women can pray. Have you ever thought what would happen if the women stopped praying? You know, sometimes we talk about what men do and we don't really give a lot of emphasis to what women are doing, but think about all the prayers that are offered on a daily basis by women. Women for their husbands, women for their children, women for the elders, women for the leaders of this church. Have you thought about all the prayers that are offered by the women in this congregation? And how effective those prayers are? Extremely powerful through your prayers. It was made unto God. That's where the prayers were being directed. They were being directed to God. They were being directed for Him. Literally, they were calling Peter by name. Praying for Peter. What were they praying for? They knew James had just been killed. Perhaps they were praying that Peter's life would be spared. Perhaps they were praying that Peter would get out of prison. If that's what they were praying, what can you say about their prayers? They were effective. But even though they were effective, and we just read that the church was praying without ceasing unto God for Peter, when Peter comes knocking at the gate, how does the church react? Can't possibly be Peter. Why not? It can't be Peter. You've got to be wrong about that, Rhoda. Peter's in prison. You think about how sometimes we're so out of touch. We pray for something and then when it stares us in the face we say, it just can't be. Why not? Have we not been praying for it? What does it mean to watch and to pray? It means to pray looking for what? Looking for the answer to that prayer. We bow our heads, we close our eyes, we say our prayer, we open our eyes, and what are we looking for? We're looking for the answer to that prayer. We pray confidently. Here, perhaps they're praying for the release of Peter. Here's Peter released. And yet they seem to be dumbfounded by the fact that Peter's out of jail. That's what they've been praying for. Why didn't they expect it? Prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. And when Herod would have brought him forth, the same night Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and the keepers before the door kept the prisoner. The same night. Herod was intending to bring Peter forth. God knows Herod's timetable, right? He knows how long Peter's going to be in that jail cell. He knows how long Peter's got before Herod's going to step forth to execute him. God knows exactly the timetable. Perhaps that's why Peter is as guarded as he is. Herod knows what's about to take place. It says in verse 7, And behold, the angel of the Lord came upon him, and a light shined in the prison. And he smote Peter on the side. Why do you think he smote Peter on the side? Wake him up. Peter's asleep. Have you ever taken time to really look at people, children of God, who are in captivity, children of God who are in difficult circumstances, and yet they're sleeping like babies? You ever thought about that? Here's Peter. Peter's between two soldiers. He's already executed James. Peter knows he's next. What's Peter doing? He's sleeping. Peter, how can you sleep? What would Peter have told you? God's in control. I serve a God who never slumbers. I serve a God who never sleeps. Why should I stay up? God's up. God's in charge of this. Why should I be up? Why should I be losing sleep over this? Philippians chapter 4 says, Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. Peter had done that, right? Not anxious for anything. He knows that God's in charge of this. God's handling this. You think about Daniel in the lion's den? Same situation, right? Daniel knows God's ultimately in charge. You're able to sleep when you know that God's in charge. And so smote him on the side, raised him up, saying, Arise up quickly, and his chains fell off his hands. Just that quickly, the chains just come off. God has the key to every shackle, doesn't He? Not a shackle ever been invented that God doesn't have the key to, whatever that shackle is. Does God have the key to the shackles of drunkenness? Absolutely. Does God have the keys to the shackles of drugs? Absolutely. Does God have the keys to the shackles of immorality? Absolutely. God has the keys to all of those shackles. God can open every one of them. Does God have the keys to the shackles of denominationalism? You better believe He does. God can open every one of those shackles. God has the key that fits them all. He had the key that fit Peter's chains here. They fell off his hands. Lord willing, we'll begin there next time.